Hello, I am Susie, and this is my podcast. Welcome to part 3 of my series on work. It's a pretty central part of all of our lives, I would argue. In the previous 2 parts, I discussed history of labor. I talked a little bit about the Industrial Revolution and its effects on labor. I talked a lot about unions, and I talked a little bit about the distinction between work and labor and the political ramifications of that. And in this next bit, I'm going to dive a little bit more into socialist ideals and how those socialist ideals have informed American culture vis-a-vis its labor policies. And not necessarily how socialism shaped those policies, but how resistance to socialism shaped policies in some respects. It's an interesting mix, you know. The American political system is a like pendulum, like swinging wildly through eternity from one side of the spectrum to the other at various speeds throughout history. It's really interesting, fascinating to watch, frustrating to live through, but a beautiful experiment nevertheless. So I hope you'll hang out with me and hear a little bit of what I have to say about that. Hey, hot take alert. I think Adolf fucking Hitler ruined any chance that a democratic socialist government could exist within the next century. Adolf fucking Hitler was such a weak and just maladapted, narcissistic, and mentally fragile person that he had this desire to exist in all of the splendor of Austria. The aristocratic class in Vienna, in particular, was it glittered. They shined. They sparkled. They had all the things and all the stuff and the fancy, newfangled inventions, and the future looked so bright. And he wanted so much to be a part of that. He aspired to artistic nobility. He saw his path to stardom at the end of a paintbrush, but he wasn't very good, unfortunately. He lacked artistic vision, and according to the Academy in Vienna, artistic talent. I think that's debatable. I mean, I've seen his work, and it's not completely without talent, but I think I'll explore ideas of art and culture a little more in depth in a later episode. I am sure. I don't have one planned yet, but it feels obvious for me to do that. I mean, at this point, if you've listened, I think you might agree. It seems like it's like inevitable that that's going to happen at some point, and I do have thoughts about it, as as apparently with everything else. I don't know what that says about me. Be that as it may, Hitler. I want to kind of make a quick disclaimer here. I realize that there's a little bit of a minefield relative to the ideas of speaking about Nazis and Hitler and drawing any kind of a basis of comparison to, the current political landscape. I'll be honest, I see both sides of that argument, but I do think that it is a little bit of a boy who cried wolf situation where, if you're a liberal, the minute you bring up Hitler and the Nazis, you've gone too far. Like, you're clearly, not someone who can be reasoned with. So for that reason, I would like to just simply qualify that when I am talking about Hitler here, it is not to draw a comparison to any specific individual in American politics. It is merely the historical contextual ideals that cross those international lines. They flow in both directions, by the way. They are iterative. If you're not aware, you should be aware that the Nazis really developed a lot of their systems inspired by American power systems and American political systems through racial discrimination. So, and in fact, so much so that they were like, that's a little too harsh. Like we can't go out right out of the gate with that stuff. Like that's the goal. Like that's a good goal, but we can't start there because it's like, wow, like that's really, really, really harsh. That was from the Nazis. So just a little bit of fun perspective for you there. But again, I don't. It is not my intent to be like American politics is like littered with Nazis, and that's not the point. But very much, Hitler represents a linchpin moment in history, I think, in which the world was sort of trying to understand what would take the place of monarchic imperialist governmental systems that had been, that had this presumed dominance up until that point in time. I mean, these were countries that were inventing the new world, really. I mean, they were inventing entirely new systems of government in the case of the United States. Never before had any form of government like it existed, and never since, interestingly. Say what you will about that. I think that's interesting and layered. So I think it's worthwhile to look at these, like if you're a Doctor Who fan, you understand the idea of fixed points in time. And I think Hitler and the entire World War II era is a fixed point in time. I think if you look at the number of things that happened in World War II that were just like, if the stars hadn't aligned in like just that way, then none of it would have gone down. Like none of it would have happened the way that it did. It would have just been over in that moment, or it would have exploded in that moment, or you know what I mean? Like there are holy cats, like a billion different examples of that in World War II. I think that's really interesting. I don't believe in fate. I don't believe in destiny, but I find it really interesting. I think it does feel like energetically there's a culmination of, almost like quantum maneuverings that are coalescing energetically into this inevitable action or this inevitable series of actions. I'm not saying that's real. I'm saying like on a gut level, like that's sort of like, when I close my eyes, I can like see the network of events that happen, and they feel, I'm not suggesting that they are, I'm just saying that they feel almost contrived. Like there's a design there. And I find that interesting. So here's why I think Hitler like totally effed up any hope of socialism being considered a legitimate form of governance. So Hitler's aspirations to nobility and the finer things in life was dashed, when the Academy rejected him. But it was not just that. I mean, it wasn't obviously like, I got rejected from the Academy of Art and now I'm going to start a war. That's not obviously what happened. That's crazy. But there were a lot of things going on at the time. There was a lot of economic instability going on. Hitler served in the war. He was traumatized a lot, by what he saw and did in the war. He was not a war hero by any respect, but he was, that was a tough war. World War I was that was savagery at its finest in a mechanized age, like horror that had never been seen, on an industrial scale, just like total destruction, Armageddon type shit. Like it terrified the world. And it terrified Hitler. And he thought that, over time, this fear that he had and this anger that he had about not being given the opportunities or the privilege that he felt that he deserved, it like fomented in this visceral rage, against the establishment in a revolutionary period. There was a lot of rising socialist influence in terms of people saying, we've had enough, we're workers, please stop killing us for your capital, and, strikes and so on, parades and marches. And Hitler saw the Bolsheviks in Vienna, and it scared the shit out of him. He was like, oh my God, these people are going to destroy this, glittering class system of elites, and it's going to make everything, dirty and mongrelly and, just like scary, and, everybody will be poor or something. I really don't know like what he thought was going to happen, but he was fucking scared. Um, his reaction was to turn towards a form of governance based upon what Mussolini coined as fascism, which was a dictatorship, but it was an autocratic and kind of a meritocratic kind of elite caste system as well, and it would be based on race purity. And by the way, all the Jews are bad, 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 and that we should probably just go ahead and kill them all. That's just, I mean, it's difficult to understand how anyone could be persuaded to just, dismiss the humanity of another person based on so trivial a distinction. It's very difficult for me to understand it, which is probably one of the reasons why I think about it so much, because it happens all the time. It happens all the time. And most of our systems right now in the United States are like, based on systems that had these philosophies in mind, that these thoughts existed in the people that wrote many of the laws that are on the books, both federally and at state levels. People who believe that other types of persons are not persons, that they're cows on some basic level. Not as good, not as smart, not as worthy. Ugh. Like that's in our system. Like it's in there. It's in that DNA. Like it's gotta be driven out. It's just gotta be. But okay, I digress. So Hitler, communism. He was scared shitless of, it wasn't communism yet, right? It was socialist ideals that formated in workers' parties. And one of the things that he did when he rose to power was the Marxist Party. He destroyed it ultimately. I mean, there were assassinations carried out. There were, again, he had enough political power at this point where he was like legitimized chancellor. And, he had the ability to just start making rules about who could do what and be what and say what. And that's basically what he did. And there were like, at one time, there was like 30 some parties in German politics at that point, just all sorts of different types of governments trying to grab a foothold in this wake of, imperialistic failure, right? So power hates vacuum, and there was a huge vacuum at this point post World War One. Not to mention, Germans were feeling not a little bit persecuted, after the Treaty of Versailles, which was not at all favorable for them. And if you don't know, Google it. They, basically capped the amount of military, capped, it imposed a bunch of economic sanctions, and it also required compensation. And most Germans felt, and when I say compensation, I'm talking about obviously like billions of dollars that the German people would have to like pay other people, and also land grab. There was, they had to give back a bunch of the land that they stole, as well as give back in power within some of the land that they had prior to the invasions. Berlin being a good example of that, which up until the middle of the late part of the 1980s was divided into two halves. So East Berlin, West Berlin. The western side being the democratic side, the eastern side being the Soviet side. So there was a division of geography there that was subsequent to the war. Hitler's reaction to Bolshevism and the idea of workers' rights and organization was not necessarily distinct. A lot of Europe was reacting in just the same way. Winston Churchill, for example, he hated communists, like Russian communists. Like he was scared of the influence of Russian revolutionary forces in English society. But it was interesting because the kind of socialism that emerged in Britain was not, necessarily a Soviet type of communism. It was socialist ideals as founded by Karl Marx, as written by a German. And the ideals were much more focused on workers' rights and how workers would share in the economic power of the production process, and to create policies that would prioritize the needs of the working class and create a middle class, as opposed to prioritizing the needs of the production class, e.g., the aristocracy. It was still was there at that point. It was a resistance to the aristocracy, this idea of generational wealth that rolls over, and that was the norm. But workers were like, but that keeps me in a cycle of poverty forever and ever, where it's a sustenance living, and I only get by kind of hand to mouth, and that's the lot in life. You don't get the opportunity to wealth and power when you're constantly just struggling to make ends meet. Now, Russian communism, Soviet communism, co-opted socialist ideas, but the ideals were perverted. At its core, it continued to support autocratic regimes. Now, Russia, historically an imperialist nation and a feudal nation, serfdom was in place up until the beginning of the 1900s. It is what ultimately caused the Russian Revolution. That workers were like, hey, we're not slaves. And there were resistance movements. And Lenin stepped up and, kind of grabbed power, and he organized people, militarily pretty much, and managed to gain power through manipulation of the aristocracy. And so the aristocracy still maintained a central presence. I mean, not the Tsar, obviously. His whole family was boned. But the nobles, the sort of court class, the elite class, many of them found their way into the power structure because they had capital. So the power structure, the political power structure that emerges under Soviet communism, essentially is imperialistic in the sense that they grabbed all the turf, where those sort of weaker states that, whose political and economic integrity had been just eviscerated by the war. They swooped in, grabbed the turf, and that's not. This is difficult for me because there's a part, like, I'm not a fan of Soviet communism. It's a despotic political system that it really was, oppressive and horrible to its own people, and obviously a danger to, I feel like such an a-hole saying this, but it was a danger to freedom. It was a danger to democracy. And so I'm not, like, we should have been communists. It's not, that's not what I think. But I also think that there were moneyed interests in, preventing socialism, in having any kind of a vested influence in how people are governed. And that's problematic. I just think it's just unquestionably problematic. And so, Soviet communism was a lie from its outset. And I think because the population of that country was emerging from a system where they would have to toil for nothing, versus they would toil for a collective state and then get, just a little bit of what the state, could spare for them, while there was a whole other, smaller sector and class of people that were economically, really, really comfortable. And yeah, it's just obviously a broken system, and it was doomed to fail. So, it did in the late 80s and in the early 90s. But, the Western world's response to Soviet communism in general galvanized in such a way that, like, capitalism emerges at that point as like the natural and superior enemy. Like, if it's a binary proposition at that point. It's, democracy is equivalent with capitalism. And so capitalism is, the unspoken kind of like, this is what we stand for against communism. It's an economic assertion more than it is a political assertion. And the reason that I say that is because the United States is not a pure democracy. It never has been a pure democracy, and there are a lot of still present foundational pieces of our government that do not make us a truly representative democracy right now. It can be, it's set up to be, but there's lots of loopholes. There's lots of ways to game it, and that's happened, throughout our history. So it has continued to be a preservation of a kind of aristocratic class, a kind of bourgeoisie, if you will. Oh God, I feel like such like a 60s college douchebag when I talk like that sometimes, but it's not untrue. Like I was recently, I watched the trial of the Chicago Seven, which Aaron Sorkin directed for into a Netflix production, and Sacha Baron Cohen plays Abby Hoffman. And I honestly like I had to go back and sort of like revisit some of the original footage with Abby Hoffman, who was so easy to dislike, but such a genius and so right on the money, like in almost everything that he said. Just he just is like he's a poet warrior to me. Like he just understood. He reminds me of Walt Whitman. Like he was too crazy, to fit in, but crazy in the sense of like he was just subversive. Like he didn't give a fuck. Like he just wanted freedom, like true and pure freedom, in the most philosophical sense of the term. And I just have so much admiration for people who live like that, because that's not an easy path, man. That is not an easy path to walk, and I don't have it. I mean, I don't have it in me to just constantly be, subverting the norms, even if it as much as I'd like to. It's hard. I do it, instinctually sometimes, and I suffer the consequences for it in energy output. So I don't have energy to spare lots of time, and so it's easier to go along to get along. Let's be honest. Nevertheless, I digress. um, so again, capitalism versus communism. At the heart of both of them are ideals of autocratic regimes. They're in some ways just mirror reflections of one another. Communism was a bad brand. Political movements in the wake of World War II inevitably hold socialist principles up as an assumed assertion of Soviet communist principles, which is fully bonkers. Again, communism, capitalism share an autocratic core. So, Soviet communism. So it's a little, like the pot calling the kettle black. Propaganda that paints communism as a traitor position, right? It's just fully anti-American, kind of subverts the narrative so that you're not really talking about what's at stake. You're simply talking about what it looks like what it could represent. So it sort of misses the point entirely. But labor unions, both in their original formation in the United States in the 20s, and then, later on what they became, labor unions who emerged from socialist principles were corrupted, as discussed in many ways over time, particularly because they were, and perhaps still are, viewed as an adversarial threat to the balance of power established by capitalism. Again, that aristocratic sense of, the bourgeoisie, the sense of that power class that's like, we got ours and now we got to keep it. That's our jobs, to keep our wealth and hold it in this closed loop. The currency of power isn't monetary necessarily. Usually it's political influence. And when establishments of power see a shift in power looming, their instinctual response seems to be to try to buy their way out of it, whether through direct intervention like bribes or other like monetary exchanges, or by indirect means of coercion like nuisance lawsuits or private investigators, harassment, the millions of dollars that Amazon spent to push back on organization in New York demonstrates the industry associated with, anti-union corporate exercising. And I think that the amount of money an organization is willing to spend to tank a union says a fucking lot about what the priorities of that company are. And again, if you find yourself in a position of prioritizing capital over human life, I think that's a calculus you should probably re-examine. I don't think that any single person in the world could assert that an individual needs $1 billion to live. I don't think any individual person on earth would suggest that, a person should be limited in the resources that are available to them necessarily either. But in between there is a balance that means everybody can have enough. And again, like my kind of enough, the kind of enough that's comfortable, the kind of enough that you don't have to sweat making choices between essential things, the kind of enough that means that you can, you know, decide to take a trip or decide to buy a piece of art or, make an investment or, whatever it may be. The kind of enough that is genuinely enough, not just to live, not just to survive, but to thrive. I think it's achievable. There's plenty of enough in the world. I mean, especially if you consider the idea that, money is just made up. Money has no inherent value at all anymore. It's been completely and irrevocably dissociated from any kind of like material value. It's all in the ether now. It's just what we decide. So, I mean, you can decide anything. If we collectively agree, right? If we come to an understanding about what has value, how we choose to ascribe value, we think differently about, we'd stop trying to put dollar signs on human beings and start thinking more about, how can everybody have enough to live and be productive, and how can we help and support each other. That's just, I mean, I just feels like I don't know, that feels good, doesn't it? Like when you are thinking about how you can help somebody else. When you have enough, like when you have enough, right? Like when you're covered, when you feel good, like everything you're cool, like you got all your stuff settled and you have a backup plan for your backup plan, right? Like you're good. Doesn't it feel good in those moments to be like, hey, there's somebody who's kind of like on the struggle bus, like maybe I can grab them and give them a little push. I mean, I've done it once or twice. It feels good. it's innocently it's innocent feeling good. It's not like the guilty pleasure kind of thing. It's the kind of pleasure you could be like, wow, that's like spiritual, like legitimate pleasure. I'm feeling really good about that. Anyway, that was proselytizing. I'm sorry. I don't mean to preach. I just wish, right? Like I don't even need to finish that sentence probably. Well, this concludes my thoughts on work. Actually, you know what? That's a lie. I do have a final thought. Here's what I will say. I think that this is a very interesting time that we're living in right now. Post pandemic, we're experiencing a bit of a moment, I think, where power could shift a little bit. Workers have asserted for years and years and years that the ability to achieve balance in our lives by having, less sort of axiomatic kind of principles of how you apply yourself to your work in terms of time and the production value and where and when and how and who. And what I mean by that, of course, is like, whether you are required to meet a defined schedule within a physical place during a defined period of time, and like no exceptions, right? Which is something that I think a lot of people feel is a constraining way to live. It was totally the norm, back in a period of time when production was exclusive to a physical place, which is not our reality for most people. I'm not suggesting that for everybody, because there definitely are, avenues of employment that are very like associated with location. I work in real estate. That's one of them. But there are also many ways to skin a cat, right? Like there's many ways to achieve a certain kind of production or provide value. And it doesn't always have to meet, a given, form or model or template. And so I feel like the current posture that corporations are taking in the United States right now splits into two groups. You've got one group that's looking and seeing and understanding that workers have felt like they have demonstrated that they can both live their lives and produce an awful lot if given the flexibility to do that. And the companies are saying, this is interesting. We can do some trade-offs, right? Maybe we pay you less for a little more flexibility. Or, maybe we, kind of let you work virtually, completely. And we structure your benefits differently. There's a lot of space, right, for negotiations in there when workers feel like they are allowed to prioritize their needs. But there's another camp that is like basically, fuck you, get back to work. Like kind of a rubber band snap, like to pre-pandemic culture. I sense a lot of resistance to that. I myself feel it. I feel kind of resistance to that, where I was like, really? I mean, I proved to you I could run circles around this job without setting foot into the office at all. And I like going into the office. Don't get me wrong. I enjoy going into the office, but I also enjoy having balance in my life and not feeling guilty about not being able to work at like a specific, time when there's another commitment in my life that, I could be attending to that would take a lot of friction off of me. And therefore a lot of stress, or I have to balance a lot less if I didn't have to prioritize one thing arbitrarily over another. And again, when I feel like when I say it in those words, I'm like, it's so easy, but it's not. Of course, it's not. It's a cultural way of thinking. It's a shift in thinking, and that's difficult. I mean, that's kind of the basis of my whole podcast. Shifting in thinking is difficult, particularly on a mass scale, right? Like lots of people, you can't like move a lot of people just like with agility. It's a much more laborious and sort of like cumbersome exercise, and requires a totally different, means of propelling, if you will. So that is really it. That's the final thought that I have on that, and I'm hopeful that the future of American work looks friendlier on the American worker, both in wages and in creating space for them to have lives that don't like revolve around their obligations to their employer, which I think is kind of the balance that we're looking at right now. And it sucks. Love to have like my own life as the prioritization. I feel like everybody probably wishes that. So, hey, why not make that a goal? That seems like a good idea. So thank you so much for joining me on this little journey of mine to talk and explore the ideas of work. And I hope that you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed making this one. It was a little wandery. I'm sure you noticed a little more digression. Again, I was a little less prepared for this. I decided to try to allow a little more of a, my own internal rhythm to drive it. And I'll see in editing how that worked out, I suppose, as well as getting your feedback, I hope. So, as always, thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, I really hope you'll share it with somebody you think would enjoy it. I love dissenting views. I'd love to hear dissenting opinions, particularly if they are kindly and thoughtfully stated. You can reach me by email at Susie Makes a Podcast. That's SUZI Makes a Podcast at gmail.com. Or you can also find me on Instagram at Susie Makes a Podcast. So thanks again. I hope to compel you to come back again with another fascinating episode that you'll be really interested in. Yay! Until then.